All right. Are you
Okay,
ready to make your presentation?
sure.
Okay.
Let me be brief with y'all. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you on behalf of Simsboro Aquifer Water Defense Fund, SAWDF. We're working with landowners in Burleson, Milam, Lee, and Bastrop counties. Next slide, please, Doug. And so, as I presented back in February, I believe, was to talk about the GAM 2020, the new GAM 2020, good science, quantifiable input. I know that's what y'all need, but we want to emphasize that it's a starting point to examine unreasonable impacts. So next slide, please. So right now, from all it's the best understanding that I have of the best science that you're using is you're using the GAM 2020 to reverse engineer the desired future condition. And that formula that you're using, that you're wedded to, you voted to unanimously last time, to use the 100% of permitted pumping, that only accommodates permits. It doesn't accommodate anybody else. So in the view of SAWDF, that's not the best available science, that formula. So if we go to the next slide. So I want to use some examples because this is where I have hard data, and I know that's important to y'all. I'm showing you a methodology that you can use. I did that last time in February. I'm curious to know if there was anyone that attempted to look at any of that methodology in determining socioeconomic impact on exempt wells, and on your constituents. So I'm focusing on the Carrizo, and the data set that I had, SAWDF paid to have the GAM run. The S7 file was the one that y'all were using back in November, December. And we had the S7 file run, and I mapped out the results. So here you're looking at the drawdown for Vista Ridge pumping only that was in the S7 file. Here's the contour map showing the impacts, and there's the Carrizo wells in the Lost Pines district of Lee County. And if we go to the next slide, I'll explain why I'm focused on that. So this is the current desired future conditions for Lost Pines Groundwater Conservation District, and they had included in their management plan approved by TWDB was to do a county-wide average drawdown. And so they had the Carrizo at 64 feet in Lee County. If we go to the next slide, I know that you all struggled with the fact that we can't repeat these numbers with the current GAM, the new GAM 2020. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that what y'all did do was, to your best, using your best science, you took the new GAM and you modified the pumping files, you put a little in the alluvium, etc. And this was your best guess at what the drawdown would look like using the old pumping file, but with the new GAM to calculate it. And so 73 feet drawdown in the Carrizo is what we came up with, what y'all came up with. This is from August of 2019 when you ran the S1, 2, and 3. If we could go to the next slide, Doug. So what that works out to, when you look at, if you take the new GAM and the pumping for Vista Ridge only in the S7 file, and you map that out, you'll see the blue line there shows you the drawdown. And so the first 5 years, you have a dramatic increase. I'll show you where we're at right now. Those numbers were basically the county-wide weighted average because I have the mod flow, and so I know the surface area of each of those cells. It's different. I know the drawdown in each cell, so I can do a weighted average drawdown, which is what you have in your DFCs. And so the average would say we're at 33 feet because it's county-wide across Lee County. Of course, we know from talking with landowners, we've seen anywhere from 100, 125 to 25 feet of drawdown. So what I'm going to focus on is 2030, because that's where the vast majority of the impact will have accounted for. So look at that map again if we go to the next slide. Here's a little closer look. So here's the drawdowns in Lee County. And so I guess what I'm saying here, that countywide average obscures, I used the word hide, let's just use the word obscures unreasonable impacts. That's what it does. That expression of countywide average drawdown as your desired future condition obscures the reality that people are facing, and that's going to impact your county, your district, your economy, your constituents, the people that your groundwater rights. So here's a detail mapping some 90 exempt Carrizo wells to my best calculation in the Lee County area. And so you can see, I mean, I've got a well, and I understand how domestic exempt wells work. And when they're put in, most of them, your pump is 100, 150 feet below the surface. Can you, any one of you that lives on a domestic well, could you sustain a 50-foot loss in hydraulic head in your well within the next year or 2 years and not have to move your pump? And that's what people are feeling there, all the way from Lexington over 50 feet of drawdown at a minimum by 2030. And that's before the full effects. That 50 moves to just the other side of Lexington when you look at it, and when you look at the contour maps going out to 2050. If we could go to the next slide. So my point being, you have the data. I'm this citizen scientist. I've got GIS mapping software. I've got the mod flow. I've got the GAM. I've got the results that match those that are done by your consultants. I've focused on a specific data set to show you methodology that this is not unreasonable for you to do. You have your well data sets. You've got increasingly accurate information about well depth. Maybe you even know where the screens and the pumps are. You can run simple calculations that tell you how many wells are going to be affected in each formation. You can do this. You can do it right in your GIS software. You can go into that model and do some calculated fields and begin to come up with these results. If we could go to the next slide. And so here's my results. Knowing what we know about wells and how you're going to have to move your pump after you lose 50 feet ahead in your well, you're more than likely going to have to move your pump. So there's several things I want to say about that, but one is it's going to have to be done. So just those 90 wells that I mapped for you, if we take that 73 feet of drawdown that's anticipated, that's using the new GAM with the old pumping files, there's 6 wells that I can tell you in there will have to be re-drilled. There's no way they can get their pump any lower to be able to draw water, and probably 73 of those have to move their pump at some point in that time period. Next slide, please. So if you all could consider, is 80% of exempt wells needing to be mitigated and 7% of the wells will fail? Is that reasonable? So SAWDF's position is that's an unreasonable impact on exempt domestic livestock and irrigation wells. And that was in that data set of 90 wells that I did, were only domestic livestock, or if they're irrigation, it's under, it's an exempt amount of water that they produce. Because I can do that with your well data files. I can sort through that. And so I'm not looking at the municipal wells in Giddings or the municipal wells in Lexington. Next slide, please. So you have to balance, and you all know this by heart, so I won't beat that horse. If we go to the next slide, please. What I just, and I should have added to this, so your formula, the way you're using the GAM to reverse engineer the DFCs is doing 100% to the permits and nothing. There's nothing in that formula that accommodates 87% of your wells that are going to be impacted, exempt wells. 87% of exempt wells in Lee County will be impacted by just the current DFC, let alone the future DFC that you voted on, which is double the current. So your formula does this: 100% permits, nothing for everybody else. And you boxed yourself in, you've painted yourselves into this corner with this formula. So if we could go to the next slide. And that's because those DFCs are reverse engineered. And the other thing is that countywide average drawdown obscures these impacts. You don't see it. You go and measure well, the water level in all these wells, and you report that data. But are you mapping that out? And are you asking yourself the question? I heard that a little bit from Gary when he's talking about their well assistance program is starting to map some of that data. But I haven't heard that discussion from anybody else at GMA 12. Next slide, please. So I know we're late in the process. I've heard that from y'all loud and clear. I know you need quantifiable data. So you have some. You have the DFC that you voted on. My SAWDF suggestion to you, strong suggestion, is that you go with the S3 run, that you use the new GAM 2020, but you use that best accommodation of those old pumping files, and you go with those DFCs that would be generated. They're still going to be different from the ones that are on the books. Like I showed you with Lost Pines, they're going to go from 62 feet in the Carrizo, it would be 73 feet in the Carrizo, using best available science. But you're not ready to double the drawdown in the desired future conditions. You've got to go to public comment period. I understand that. So when you publish for the public in May for the 90-day comment period, you publish, and that should be, my suggestion is you publish the S3 DFCs and tell them for what they are. Tell them this is accommodating 100% production by permitted holders. And so whether you use S12 or S3, we hope you'd use S3, but I may be fighting a losing battle there. You publish, in addition to that, by decade, the contour maps, like I showed you, with the wells plotted out, and do that by formation. Because then people, the public, can clearly see what's going on. You're not going to get public comment if you publish a little table that shows, 7 different numbers for the aquifers or formations, and by 2050. You're not explaining to people what that means. You're obscuring the reality. So publish the contour maps by aquifer or formation and by decade and show the plotted wells, because then I'm going to look at the map and I'm going to go, oh, look, I'm just east of town. That's probably my well right there. And then I'm going to see the contour line and it's going to say 75 feet of drawdown by 2030. And so I can be like, phew, I better start saving money to move my well, or I'm going to get involved in this process. And I don't think any of y'all are adverse to people being involved. You were hoped that they would have been from the get-go. I was one of those ignorant citizens that wasn't involved until slowly and surely I understand the implications. And the implications are my well is at risk. And that's why I'm involved. So then the caveat is, if you do not publish these maps, then I have access to the GAM runs. I have the GIS software. SAWDF will publish the maps, but will publish them with the headline, this is what your groundwater district does not want you to know. This is what your groundwater district would rather you not know, or is hiding from you, or obscuring, whatever you want to say. But it seems like that would be a reasonable thing to show people so that they can have public comment on those proposed DFCs. So next slide, please. The other thing would be, you've got to have a way to get out of the corner you've painted yourself into. You're going to add fuel to the fire if you take public comment and people tell you that's unreasonable, that's not fair, that's not suitable, etc., and you do nothing with it. If you maintain the DFCs you voted on and only a 10% variance, and you do not allow yourself to move to either walk back the pumping file or to set a different DFC with a substantiated explanatory document telling you why it's different, then you will add fuel to the fire to every exempt well owner, every landowner with water rights in your district, to know that all you care about is somebody's St. Augustine grass in San Antonio and not about them. So you've got to find, and that's something you can do today. Maybe that's when you get to agenda item 12, expression of the DFC. You can give yourself some place to save face or to walk back some of these things. Because right now, everything that I've heard, you all have no way to accommodate public comments. You have no way to change those hard numbers you voted in, except for 10%, after you receive public comment. And if you publish those contour maps, you're going to get public comment. And you've got to have a way to respond. So please, today, SAWDF recommends you vote in some way for you to be able to have some fudge room, move those numbers. And I admit I'm ignorant about some aspects of this. You all understand the words, the planning, the policy, the management much better than I do. I'm trying to learn, but give yourself some room. I haven't heard that. If we go next slide, please. Trying to remember where I am. So then I would also then suggest not just the consideration is what I heard in February when I presented, was we can consider this in the next planning cycle, but to be sure that it gets considered in the next planning cycle, your management plan should include ongoing assessment of the impacts on exempt wells. So that should be written into your management plan. Then it can't be neglected. It can't be a can that's kicked down the road. And it makes you a better manager, your district a better manager of your groundwater resources. It allows you to better fulfill your statutory duties under the water code. And last slide, please. And then, gentlemen, I would hope that you can develop in this next cycle a different and better methodology for proposed DFCs. You come up with a different way of doing it, then you run the GAM to evaluate the DFC, not calculate the DFC. And that's what's occurring right now. So develop a better way to, and SAWDF will be more than happy to help with that. That is certainly something for that 5-year cycle discussion. A new way of doing that. We can look at other GMAs, how to do the proposed DFCs, and then use the GAM as it is a tool to evaluate those desired future conditions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Andy. That was very well done, very thorough. Appreciate all the comments, very much in line with some of our thoughts here at Post Oak Savannah. That groundwater annual needs assessment, that Ghana that I mentioned a while ago, those reports are exactly what you're talking about. They're evaluations of impact moving forward, and
how can you do that to us?
we hope to move that.
I just don't understand how you. I cannot conceive of how you could do that.
Who's talking right now? Couldn't understand who's talking right now. Okay. Any other comments or questions for Andy from anyone else from GMA 12?
I have a question, Steve Young.
Oh, sure, Steve.
Andy, you had a table in there that gave, it looked like well-specific information. Could you provide that Excel sheet to us? I also had a question. It looked like you had a depths that were a couple of depths that were negative. I wasn't too sure what was going on there. You had maximum depth. There's some negative and positive numbers. That doesn't look like there would be elevations. It's under B, dope B, and it's hard to read. I was trying to figure out what you were doing. You got maximum pump depth, some are positive and negative numbers too. I was a little confused.
Right. So Steve, if you may recall back in February when I presented that methodology. So this is taking the pump file. So I have the Lost Pines District pump file. I have it's supplemented with well driller reports, most recent ones off the Texas Water Development Board. So then using the top and bottom of the Carrizo, I know the well depths, and I converted all the well depths to MLS, to mean sea level, MSL rather. So that's why you see some negative numbers, because that well extended below mean sea level for maximum depth. And then when we ran the GAM, right? So I have the head for each cell without the pumping and with the pump over the various decades. And so remember, I talked about the structure of a well, right? Domestic well. So you've got, typically you're going to have your bottom 40 feet screened in that formation. And I calculated wells that are probably Carrizo by going 60 feet into the Carrizo, but not into the Galvert Bluff, because I have all those numbers, right, from the mod flow. And then, you know, if your bottom 40 is screened, you know where your head is. And so your typical pump is 100 feet below your hydrostatic head in that well. And I fudged that. I did 150 feet. And so then as you do the drawdown, you'll see that some people have to move their pump because they're not going to have a minimum 100 feet ahead above their pump to be able to keep from sucking air when they're producing. So those are the rough calculations that I did. I leave it to the experts like yourself to refine that. But you know enough about well structure, and you know enough data about where the formations are and the depths of these wells, that you can come up with a really good and substantial, documentation as to these are probably, Carrizo wells, and this is, if they sustain 75 feet of drawdown, and that's based on the actual drawdown, not on this fictitious DFC, which is averaged across the county, which, 1/3 of Lee County has no Carrizo in it. And yet that's in the calculation. Math teachers would throw you out the door for doing that, but you include it's averaged across the district, not even across the formation. I could understand that, but it's totally ignorant of the realities of the impact of that drawdown. And this is, this was GAM based on the whole, anyway, I leave it to yourself to refine this information. But that method, that way of determining where the wells are, how deep they are, how much theoretically loss they could sustain, when they would probably have to move their pump, that tells you wells that need to be mitigated. Then there's certain wells that you can never drop the pump any lower. And those are probably wells that I remember, Alan, you asked me when I presented in February about, what do we have to care about every well? Well, think about it. You mentioned shallow wells that day, and I would call them established wells. So think about the people that were there before groundwater districts even existed. Now you've moved the bar 3 times deeper. And Alan, you said, well, there was more sand there. They should have drilled deeper. So they should have, gone and seen Madame Zosa, and had their fortune read that would have told them that somehow the groundwater levels were going to drop 150 feet and they should drill further. No one knew that was going to happen or that these things were going to take place. And each session, y'all have moved the bar lower and lower. And it's more difficult. People can't plan for the future to mitigate this. And they have, and you all have emphasized, they have just as much right to that water as your permit holders. And yet all the calculations and discussion that I have heard take place is, and we discuss at SAWDF, has been about how to maintain the permit holders. And rarely, except for, and I'm not in Post Oak's defense, but the only one that mentioned in the letter from Steve Wise from their DFC committee that said, we're concerned about these exempt wells in the Carrizo, and that's why we want to move our pumping numbers. And taking on whatever risks were associated with that. And that's the only discussion I've heard of that. And on the other end of that balance bar, everything else has been, how do we accommodate 100% permit production? I haven't heard the word sustainability, and that's in this last slide. Incorporate sustainable groundwater production. When the reality of that new DFC, and I showed that to Jim Totten and to Andy Don, he's going to share it with Andy. So if you do a cross section across that Northeast Lee County, if you take the new proposed DFC into place, but you do the actual contour map, you're going to bring the hydrostatic head in those domestic wells within 50 feet of the top of the Carrizo, all the way from Tanglewood down to the Vista Ridge pumping field. You're going to be like 50 feet off of the top of those Carrizo sands. Now, how were domestic well owners, exempt well owners, supposed to anticipate that? And where are they going to eventually? Where are they going to put their pumps? Those are the realities that are obscured by this current formula. I mean, and if you're wedded to the formula, then then allow people to put in subtract pumping to accommodate exempt wells. I mean, if it's going to be a formula, we put in 100% pumping, we subtract the pumping we want to pumping that's going to protect our domestic wells, not just the domestic well production, because that can never compete. You know, you have maybe 8,000 acre feet of domestic well, exempt well production against 75,000, in Lost Pines case, 108,000 acre feet of permitted pumping is going to compete with about 8,000 in domestic. So that's not fair. You got to be able to allow people to put into that formula. If you're going to use a formula, then say, here's the permitted pumping less the pumping that our district, our board has decided they're going to withhold or reserve or conserve. Isn't that in your language? This is the water we're going to conserve for both the health of the aquifer and for groundwater rights and for the socioeconomic issues. This is the water we're going to reserve as part of our balancing act. And so this is the total resultant pumping over this, and you have it tiered in, you know, I have the all the time period. Now run the GAM and
Andy,
tell me these are the desired future conditions.
Andy, thank you for.
I'm sorry.
No, you have a lot to say, and we kind of got to where maybe you were repeating some of those things. I wanted to see if anybody had any further questions, specific questions for you before we moved on, is what I was trying to get to. Do any of the other GMA 12 folks have any other questions for Andy? Okay. All right, then, Andy, thank you again.